They tied her to the post like they would a wild horse. Barefoot, with her wrists bound behind her back, Issa stood in the middle of Hollow Rock's square, where the ground was more dust than soil, and the sun bore down without mercy. That post had seen livestock sold, criminals shamed, and men hanged, but never a woman. Never one so young, with blood in her mouth and silence in her eyes. She did not weep. The braid her mother once made with songs and careful hands now hung low and dirt-streaked, dragging across the gravel with each shift of her shoulders. The people, her people, stood watching, whispering like wind through brittle grass. They did not stop it. They did not look away either. Eyes hungry for obedience, souls hollowed out by fear. Some were kin, most were neighbors, all were silent. The sheriff raised his hand again. Rawhide whip coiled like a snake in his grip. "This is the price of dishonor," he said, but his voice cracked, and his eyes slid away from hers. He wouldn't meet them, not even once. The second strike landed harder than the first. It tore through fabric and found flesh. Issa's knees trembled. She bit down on her own tongue to keep from screaming, and blood touched her teeth like some sacred, bitter offering. Pain burned, but pain was not the worst of it. No, it was the way her father stood by and said nothing. Arms crossed, eyes locked not on her but on the ground, as though he had no daughter at all. She had refused Pike, Ezra Pike, the man with money in one hand and rotting ambition in the other. Twice her age, rich in mules and fields, poor in soul, he offered 5 acres and 2 animals for her hand, and her father had agreed. Just like that, as if she were wheat, traded for seed. But Issa had said no. Not softly, not secretly. She had said it with wind in her lungs and all the sharp edges her voice could carry. She had said it in front of the town, in front of Pike, in front of her father. And for that, they called her ungrateful, unwomanly, dishonorable. The third strike came. She faltered, her body curled forward, involuntary, clinging to the post like a drowning thing. Still, she did not cry out. The crowd murmured. The heat shimmered. Somewhere, a child asked why the lady was being hurt. The mother hushed him quickly. Too quickly. From the edge of the square, a man stood still as a tree. He wore a coat of buckskin, weathered by mountains and stories untold. His face carried the lines of wind and sun, carved deep with time and silence. His name was Tacky, though most in town called him Ghost or Shadow or nothing at all. Lakota by blood, a hunter. A man without a house, without a wife, without a place at their table. They didn't trust him, but they feared him more. He watched. When the fourth lash came and Issa slumped again, it was not her voice that cracked, it was something else. Her pride, her hope, something inside gave way, not broken, but too weary to keep standing. Enough, someone murmured, but the elders shook their heads. 7 lashes, they said. 1 for each day she delayed her father's honor. Tacky turned then, not to interfere, not to speak. He simply walked away, slow and sure, into the tree line. Some thought he didn't care, but Issa saw the truth through bloodied eyes. His hands were clenched, his jaw tight. He had memorized every wound with the stillness of a warrior. And in that single moment before the 5th lash fell, she saw him see her, and that was enough to remember how to breathe. By nightfall, Issa crawled away from Hollow Rock. Her blouse stuck to torn flesh, her feet bare and blistering. She had no food, no plan, only the knowledge that no one would follow her, not to save her. At least, her father had turned his back. Her home was no longer a home. It was a memory smeared in ash and silence. "You brought this on yourself," he had said. Those words struck harder than the whip. She fled into the hills, where the trees whispered not in gossip but in warning. Coyotes howled in the dark. The stars did not guide her, they watched. Cold, distant, impassive, her steps grew weaker, her legs folding beneath her beside a rock face. There, she crawled into the roots of an old tree and laid her cheek to the soil, whispering her name like a prayer she no longer believed. Hours passed, maybe days. Time grew soft and slippery. She dreamt of fire and faces and sharp things. She dreamt of hands reaching, voices fading, the echo of her own silence loud as thunder. And then, a scent, smoke, bark, the warm weight of blankets. She awoke to crackling flames and the soft rustle of leather. Taki sat nearby, his hands steady, his presence quiet but unmistakable. He stirred a pot that smelled of pine and root and something like healing. "You shouldn't be alive," he said, "not cruel, just truth." Issa tried to move, but agony climbed her spine like fire ants. She gasped, and he was beside her, holding her down with gentle strength. "Lie still," he said, "the wounds are deep, some will scar." She looked up at him through half-lidded eyes, throat dry, soul quieter than it had ever been. "Why?" she asked. "Why did you bring me here?" Taki met her eyes, not with pity, with recognition. "Because you didn't scream." Those 4 words shattered her more than the lash ever could. He had seen her, not as weak, not as fallen, but as unbroken. And in his silence, there was no judgment, only space. That night, as wind howled beyond the cave, Issa didn't cry. She closed her eyes, feeling warmth on her skin for the first time in days, not just from the fire, but from presence, from the fact that someone, anyone, had chosen not to look away. She whispered to no one, "Please don't let him vanish." And for the first time since the post, she did not dream of pain. She dreamed of running barefoot across hills that would not judge her, under skies that did not demand her silence. And she dreamed of stars, not distant, but rising. The forest held her like a cradle of old bones and older songs. Issa lay still, her face against the hollowed earth, wrapped in smells of pine ash and cool moss. The pain was still there, sharp and constant, stitched into her skin like thorns under bark, but it no longer screamed. It whispered now, fading into the rhythm of breath and wind and fire. She opened her eyes slowly, not out of fear, out of awe. A fire danced nearby, quiet and steady, not large, but warm enough to hold back the bite of the wind. Taki sat cross-legged beside it, stirring a pot with the same patience the earth gives to trees. Steam rose from it, thick, fragrant, full of something that smelled like memory and medicine. Rabbit, bark, crushed root, healing, not just feeding. For a long time, she said nothing, and neither did he. But that silence was not emptiness. It was recognition, a moment stitched by something older than words. When she finally shifted, the blanket on her shoulders slid to reveal her bandaged back, cloth soaked in sap and crushed leaves. His hands had done this, gentle, firm, and without shame. He had touched every wound with the quiet of someone who knew pain and did not fear it. "You're awake," he said, not turning. Issa blinked, throat dry. "I'm alive." "You are." She let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. It trembled out of her like smoke from a dying fire, curling into the night air and disappearing between the trees. She hadn't thought she would survive. She hadn't planned to. But somehow, here, now, life was back inside her, rising slowly, like sap through broken branches. "Eat," he said, holding out a wooden bowl carved by hand, its edges worn from years of use. She took it with both hands, weak but grateful, and let the first spoonful touch her tongue. The stew was hot, earthy, bitterness from herbs, sweetness from marrow, and beneath it all, something sacred, the kind of flavor you only find when someone wants you to live. Each bite anchored her, like pegs in shifting soil. Her hands trembled, her lips burned from the heat. But she didn't stop, not until the bowl was empty, and the hollow inside her belly was replaced by warmth. She looked up, tears stinging her eyes, uninvited but honest. "Thank you," she whispered, voice hoarse with gratitude. He didn't nod, didn't speak, just watched her, his gaze as calm and wild as the stars overhead. It was not approval in his eyes, nor pride. It was truth, the kind that says, "You belong. You endure. You matter." That night, Issa lay beside the fire, wrapped in a deerskin cloak that smelled of wood smoke and thyme. She did not cry. She did not dream of whips or townspeople or her father's voice. She dreamed of the river she once saw as a child, and how it glistened with moonlight like silver scales on a sleeping fish. By morning, the pain had dulled to a bruise deep within her bones. It did not leave, but it had changed. It was hers now, not theirs. A reminder, not a wound. Taki was already awake, his knife carving strips of bark into kindling. He didn't greet her. He didn't need to. She rose slowly and sat beside him, the deerskin cloak still drawn tight around her shoulders. He handed her a stone blade. Rough but balanced. Peel, he said. She blinked. I've never. Then learn. And so she did. With hands still healing, she peeled bark. She slipped once, blood beading along her finger. But he didn't move to stop her. He only watched, not cold, not distant, just present, trusting. Over the days that followed, Issa learned things that had never mattered in Hollow Rock. How to find water in dry places. How to listen to the wind to know when weather turns. How to trap rabbit without scaring the forest away. How to sharpen a blade with river stone. How to make fire with breath and patience. Each lesson was given once. Never repeated, never softened. But with each success, no matter how small, her chest swelled, not with pride, but with something sacred, a flicker, a flame, a knowing. She was being reborn, not with chants or names or ceremony, but through bark and bone and sweat, through calluses on her hands and strength in her step, through the way her eyes learned to see like a hunter's, not just the world, but the truth beneath it. Taki never touched her again after that first night, not without need. Not without consent, but his presence was constant. He sat nearby when she practiced throwing stones at a stump. He corrected her grip when she held the knife wrong. He showed her where not to step when tracking deer. And every time she failed, every misstep, every broken arrow, every wasted hour, he let her carry it. Not to punish her, to trust her. Issa had never known that kind of freedom. Not from her father, not from her town, not even from herself. It made her weep once. Just once, as she sat beside the creek with a pile of snapped branches in her arms. Her tears fell into the water, vanishing like they had never been. Taki said nothing, but that night, he placed a pouch beside her bedroll, soft hide filled with dried herbs for the pain in her back. She looked at it for a long time. He had seen, he always saw. One morning, as they walked the ridge to check the snare lines, she stopped and let her eyes sweep across the valley below. This is the first time I've breathed without pain, she said softly. Taki looked at her, the wind catching the edge of his coat. It's not the air, he said. It's because you're finally breathing as yourself. She didn't answer, but inside her chest, something opened. A bird, perhaps, or a root-splitting stone. Whatever it was, it stretched wide and filled her with a feeling she did not yet have a word for. Not joy, not yet, but beginning. And sometimes, that was enough. Some silences beg for mercy. Others hold rage like a stone in the hand. But there is another kind, a silence like wind before a storm. Steady and patient, waiting not to destroy but to endure. Issa's silence had once been mistaken for obedience. Hollow Rock taught her that. But the woman now sharpening her blade by firelight was not the same girl tied to that post in the square. She no longer belonged to fear. The earth had taken her pain, buried it deep beneath the pine roots. The fire had burned her shame away, and the trees had whispered a truth she finally believed. You are not theirs to punish. You are not theirs to forget. The snows had not yet come, but the mornings grew colder. Taki had begun packing rations differently, faster, tighter, always watching the tree line with eyes that caught more than Issa could see. He said little, but she knew something stirred. And it came at dawn. Not with drums, not with screams, but with boots and silence. 3 men, cloaked in tan dusters, rifles slung across their backs, faces stained by memory. They moved like they knew where she would be, because they did. Pike's men, the same ones who had jeered while she bled in the dirt. Who had handed her father silver in exchange for silence. They thought she would run. Issa didn't. She stood by the river's bend where roots grew thick and stones were sharp underfoot. She had come for water, but her knife was always with her now, hidden beneath folds of deer hide. Close enough to draw without a thought. The first man stepped wrong. A twig cracked. Issa did not freeze. She turned, fast, low, ready. He lunged with bare hands, assuming fear. What met him was steel. The blade slashed across his forearm. Clean and deep, he roared, stumbling backward, red staining his coat. The second came from behind, arms wrapping her waist, trying to lift her like cattle. She bent low, shifted her weight, drove her elbow into his ribs. Bone cracked. He fell gasping. Pain flared in her back, old wounds stretching, but she stood straight. Teeth clenched, knife wet in her grip. Then the third man drew iron. A pistol, black and gleaming in the morning light. And before Issa could move, thunk, an arrow tore through the man's wrist, dropping the gun before it could sing. The scream that followed was swallowed by forest. Taki stood across the clearing, bow still raised, eyes cold as stone. He didn't move, didn't speak. The man fell to his knees, clutching his ruined hand. Issa stepped forward. She didn't wipe her blade, didn't look away. "Tell Pike," she said, voice low and clear, "that the girl he tried to bury didn't die." The man snarled, "You think this ends with you?" Taki approached now, slow and grounded, each step a message. "It ends," he said, "when men like him stop trying to own what was never theirs." None of them replied. They limped away, dragging their wounded behind them, leaving blood in their path like a warning. Issa stood where she was, chest heaving, not with panic, but with clarity. She wiped her knife on grass and walked to the river. There, she knelt and dipped her hands into the cold, washing away the blood. When she looked up, Taki was watching. "I didn't think I'd ever be able to fight," she said softly. "But you did." She shook her head. "Not because I'm brave, because I had no choice." He knelt beside her, his hand not reaching, but near. "Bravery," he said, "is choosing to stand when you could still run." Their shoulders brushed as they sat in the quiet. The water moved, the trees swayed, but inside Issa, something else was moving now. A fire that didn't consume, but carried. That night, they didn't light a fire. Not because they feared another attack, but because they no longer needed fire to see. The moon was full, the stars were plenty. They sat back to back, wordless. And for the first time since that day at the post, Issa did not carry shame in her spine. Her wounds were now stories, told in flesh, carried with pride. In the days that followed, Issa moved differently. She was no longer learning survival. She was shaping it. She set traps before Taki asked. She mended snares with thread from bark and tendon. She carved spoons from cedar and caught fish with her bare hands. Taki watched, his words fewer now, but his gaze softer. He never praised, but he stayed. And that meant more. She no longer asked why he'd helped her. Now, she asked what comes next. And the answer came to her one morning. In the hush between Bairdcall and sunrise, Issa stood at the edge of the ridge and looked down toward Hollow Rock. The town had not changed, but she had, and what had been taken from her, voice, place, worth, she now held again. "I'm going back," she said. Taki, sitting by the fire, turned his head slowly. He said nothing for a long while. Then, "Not to fight?" "Not yet." He nodded once. "Then I walk beside you." They arrived in silence, two shadows emerging from the wilderness, cloaked in leather and wind. Issa's braid was gone, replaced by loose waves tied back with woven thread. Her knife was not drawn, but it hung visible, her back straight, her chin high. The townsfolk saw her and went still. The baker dropped a sack of flour. A woman pulled her daughter behind her skirts. The sheriff, mid-conversation, paled. Pike's office curtains twitched. Issa walked past the hitching post, still stained with her blood, and did not look at it. She walked to the general store, placed a bundle of herbs on the counter. "For Martha Whitlow's cough," she said, "and Annie's fever. Boil it 3 times. The shopkeeper nodded but said nothing. She crossed the square. Pike did not show his face. Word traveled faster than hooves. By dusk, no one dared speak her name aloud, but everyone remembered it. That night, as she and Taki returned to their camp on the ridge, she looked down at the town, once a grave, now a witness. "They're afraid," she said. "Good," Taki replied. "But they didn't stop me. Because they can't." She sat by the fire, pendant glinting at her throat, the one he had carved. "It's not revenge I want," she said. "It's to be seen." Taki watched her. "They saw you." She shook her head. "No, they saw who they made. Now they'll see who I became. They tried to erase her. They burned her home. They scarred her skin. They sold her future for land and animals. They told the town she was shame. They told her she had no place. But earth remembers what fire tries to destroy. And names. when spoken from the bone, do not vanish. They echo. They root. They rise. Issa returned not with fury, but with form. She came not as girl nor ghost, but as presence. No longer did she walk with her eyes lowered. No longer did she belong to any father, sheriff, or man with gold in his teeth. She walked into Hollow Rock a second time, head unbowed, scars visible, the pendant at her throat catching sunlight like truth. Behind her, Taki walked not ahead, not behind, but beside, like a wind shadow, like a vow. The town was quieter than before. People didn't jeer now, they watched. They whispered, yes, but their voices carried caution, not contempt. The sheriff didn't meet her eyes. Ezra Pike didn't come outside. Even the children, taught by fearful mothers to avoid her, peered from behind porch beams, wide-eyed and still, for they saw something in her walk, in her silence, in the way the dust no longer clung to her feet. She belonged to no one. And somehow, that made the land itself soften for her steps. She didn't stay long. She left herbs in the store, clean bandages with the widow by the well. She spoke only to those in need. She didn't ask forgiveness. She didn't offer apology. She left no opening for ridicule. Only evidence of who she had become. A healer. A protector. A name reborn through ash. By nightfall, Issa and Taki were gone again, moved deeper into the forest, where the pines whispered of old ones, and the earth opened wide for new stories. There, they built not a fortress, but a home, stone by stone, hand by hand. They carved a space from the wild not to hide, but to belong. A small cabin, roofed in bark and sealed with mud, smoke rising through a chimney built of river stones. A stream nearby, clean and cold, herbs hanging from rafters, a fire always burning low in the hearth. Even in summer, she hung the pendant he gave her by the door. And above it, etched into the wood with her own hands, she carved the name he had once whispered into her palms. Wika Wapi, the woman who rises like stars. Not because she was better than others. Not because she wanted worship. But because she refused to stay beneath any foot. They didn't speak much of Hollow Rock after that. They didn't have to. The town had changed. Quietly. Permanently. The sheriff retired within the year. The whipping post disappeared one night, burned in secret. The ash scattered by river wind. Ezra Pike sold his land and vanished. Chased by whispers no coin could quiet. But Issa never returned to live among them. She had nothing to prove, and everything to protect. She became legend not through revenge, but through presence. Children who wandered too far into the woods sometimes found feathers tied with red thread, or trinkets carved from bone, or bundles of dried herbs left on stones like blessings. They spoke of a woman with eyes like dusk and hands that smelled of cedar. They said she didn't walk like other women. She walks, one girl once whispered, like the ground listens when she moves. And no one laughed, because somewhere deep down, even the ones who once doubted, believed. Issa bore no children of her own. But she became mother to many. To the frightened, to the lost, to the girls who didn't want to marry the men their fathers chose. They came in the night, one by one, and she welcomed them with warm food and silence that healed. Taki taught them how to track deer. Issa taught them how to track truth. They learned that fire can burn, but it can also warm. That blades can hurt, but they can also carve paths. And most of all, they learned that silence does not mean surrender. In her final years, Issa sat beside Taki beneath the great birch tree behind their cabin. Her hair had silvered, his hands had slowed, but their fire still burned. They watched sunsets in silence, not because there was nothing to say, but because everything had already been said through how they had lived. One evening, as stars bled across the sky like scattered prayers, she leaned her head against his shoulder and whispered, "They tried to take everything." And he replied, "And still, you became everything." After they passed, the forest did not grieve. It simply remembered. Their home stood untouched, wrapped in vines and wind. Travelers came and went. Some carved tokens into trees. Some left offerings on the doorstep. No one dared take anything. And beside the river, beneath a stone carved with signs few could read, the story was still told. Not in books, not in churches, but around fires, In songs passed between women. In the glances shared when injustice rose again. They would say her name in whispers that felt like armor. Isa, Wika Wapi, the woman who rose. Not because she fought loudest, but because she never bowed. Because they tried to erase her, and failed. Because she became what fire could not destroy.